Hello, it's Big Cheds. I'm back with another chapter of My Battles with Cancer, a patient and caregiver's candid memoir. This is my story of fighting cancer and taking care of my mother while she was diagnosed with cancer. And I originally published this book back in 2020, and along with my other books, Trading Quotes and Trading Wisdom. It's available on Amazon, Kindle paperback, audiobook. But I want the whole thing to be free for anybody who wants to read it, who they think it might help. And that's why I'm doing this here on YouTube, one chapter at a time. We are in part 3 of the book, the most difficult part. For me, emotionally, the most serious part, and everything is kind of coming to a head. Mom's in the hospital, and things are slipping away quickly. So, the source of life. Saturday night. All throughout the day and night, Mom's oxygen troubles persisted, and her confusion while talking to others made it clear just how much she was struggling. The doctors and nursing staff continued to ask Mom twice a day a series of questions to ascertain her mental status, such as what day it was and why she was in the hospital. At this point, she was barely responding, if at all, to these questions, and this is likely due to a lack of oxygen, but also due to her highly medicated state. For much of my time with her, she was in and out of sleep and barely interacting when she was awake, and as the evening went on, she would only occasionally open her eyes. During one of these moments, when I was telling her how much I loved her, she opened her eyes and put her finger on my nose, smiling at me lovingly and playfully. And that was such a touching moment. And it assured me that my mom was still there and loved me with all her heart. And I will never forget that moment. After visiting hours ended, things started to quiet down on the hospital floor. My dad, my sister, and my aunt were all still there, spending time with Mom. It was my turn to be with her, so they were resting in the visitors' lounge. During this time, I sat in the chair next to Mom, and I continued to stare at the oxygen monitor number on the monitor above her head. And this task became an increasingly stressful one as the night wore on, and I was unable to focus on anything else with Mom's life hanging in the balance. Washing over me was an intense feeling of panic as everything continued to spiral out of control. So I did my best to stay distracted by watching some videos on YouTube while I had held Mom's hand. After a while, my sister came back in, and I let her know that I needed to go for a walk to try to clear my head. What a feeling it was to step outside of the hospital and to breathe some fresh air, knowing that Mom was inside the hospital and about to pass on from this world. I was in desperate need of some perspective, and I just could not find it. But I did know that I needed to be with Mom. After clearing my head, I went back inside and I prepared to stay with her for the rest of the night. And before leaving, my sister wanted the nurses to reposition Mom again so she could breathe better. After a few adjustments and several strategically placed pillows to help her stay in place, Mom seemed to be doing better. My sister was also watching that oxygen monitor the way I was, like a hawk. And when Mom's oxygen number ticked back up to 96 after being repositioned, we both looked at each other with a pleasantly surprised look on our faces. My sister left shortly thereafter, and I felt as if we were in a good place to not only make it through the night, but possibly even to see Mom rebound in the morning based on her improved oxygen level. After setting up the reclining chair with a new bedsheet and pillow, I angled the chair so I could lay prone and still hold Mom's hand. From my position, I was able to see her oxygen level on the display panel, and as time went on, I squeezed her hand to repeatedly let her know that I was with her, hoping that my energy and presence could make her feel better. As this was happening, I kept coming back to how strange it was to only be 3 rooms down from where I spent 5 days before Christmas that prior year. I could not figure out what it meant, but there was a certain symbolism to it. I felt like we were in the right place, even though there was tragedy afoot. An hour or so later, the nurse came back to check on Mom and to see if we had everything we needed for the night. And after confirming that we were all set, I struck up a conversation with her. We talked about how Mom was doing, and she reflected that Mom seemed to be pretty stable at that point. And the nurse also commented that it seemed like Mom and I were pretty close. She had observed that when I showed up that morning, it dropped Mom's pulse by 15 points. And I took those comments to heart, understanding that Mom and I do have a close bond. And it was really important for me to do everything I could to make sure that she was comfortable while I was there. The nurse also told me that she was impressed with how well Mom had been holding on, and she said that she thought Mom was funny, in addition to having a strong will. The nurse also explained that she had taken care of Mom a few days prior when she was more talkative, and she had found her to have a good sense of humor. Commenting that this nurse had a really tough job, I told her that I imagined it must be so incredibly hard to work with other extremely sick patients and their loved ones on a daily basis. I also told her how Mom and I had both reflected that we could never work in an emergency room because of all the pain and suffering there. It would get to us over time, and so I admired that this nurse seemed to be handling the environment so well. She confided in me that she does from time to time sit in her car and cry before or after a shift. And though she does her best to maintain an emotional distance from the patients and the families she's taking care of, she is human and does feel the pain of those around her. She also reflected that her job is a lot easier when the sometimes deathly sick patient is surrounded by so much love, just as Mom was. She said that overall the experience can be a beautiful thing as she feeds off of that loving energy. After the nurse finished taking care of a few more things in the room, I was feeling pretty good, actually, about Mom's status. So I left the room to call one of my other aunts to tell her that Mom seemed to be doing a little bit better. I knew that this aunt had already given up hope on Mom, and I wanted to be the first one to tell her that she may have turned a corner after noticing that Mom's oxygen level had gone back up to 96. I hedged myself, of course, a little bit when I called her, only mentioning that Mom seemed to be doing a little better. Still, I felt like I was doing the right thing, and I wanted to share the good news. My aunt thanked me for the update, and consequently, almost as soon as I returned, Mom's condition started to deteriorate again. Sunday. Walking back into the room, the first thing I noticed was that Mom's oxygen level was a few points lower, and my feeling of hope was immediately dashed. As I laid my hand on her forehead, I also noticed that it was warm, and I alerted the nurse. It turned out that Mom had a fever of over 100 degrees, so they gave her some Tylenol to help to bring it down. For the rest of the night, I stayed with Mom, rotating between lying down, standing up, and whispering into her ear while holding her hand. It was incredibly emotional to watch every single breath she took, just to make sure it was followed by another. Working to help keep her calm, I stroked her hand and I caressed her temple. And though it was touch and go, Mom made it through yet another night, and I was extremely joyed by that, as I was taking it one day at a time, or even 1 hour at a time, given her fragile state. After a brief break where I walked around and I had some breakfast, I returned to consult with my siblings about Mom's status, and things were incredibly dire, and we were all waiting for more information from the team of doctors working on Mom. At about 10 o'clock that morning, the rest of the family members and I all gathered together with this team of doctors in a conference room to discuss her status. The family members took a seat around one side of the room while 7 or 8 different doctors filtered in and found places to sit or stand on the other side of the room across from us. One of the main doctors began by reviewing what had been done so far to treat Mom's cancer, starting from when she was first diagnosed to her trip overseas and now to her most recent hospital admission. The doctor explained that the most pressing issue was her breathing, and it had become more and more labored by the day due to the inflammation in her lungs. There was also the issue of the infection in her blood, for which they were giving her antibiotics, but that would take some time to see if it had any effect. Just a few hours earlier that morning, they had discovered that the infection was resistant to the first antibiotic, so they had to change her over to a new one. The room felt extremely heavy as the conversation floated back and forth between family members and medical professionals, and I remained mostly silent, just absorbing it all and feeling overwhelmed with emotion, completely stricken with fear and sadness. Much of the talk was centered around how to make Mom feel more comfortable during her final days rather than how to save her. The professionals conceded that her cancer was still growing, and even if they could stabilize her, she still had an incredibly uphill battle ahead. The pulmonary doctor explained that they could not give her any more oxygen than they currently were because the next step would be a procedure so risky that it might kill her. The only hope she had, in theory, was to recover based on the amount of oxygen they were giving her, as well as from the antibiotics and steroids that they were administering. The general consensus among the medical professionals was that it did not make sense anymore to keep her oxygen monitor on. Hearing that news was a huge blow to my gut because it meant that they really did not think she had a realistic chance to survive. The pulmonary doctor was the one leading the conversation, since Mom's most pressing issue was her breathing, not the fact that her cancer was spreading. Again, the doctor stated that even if Mom recovered from this breathing issue, they still would have to deal with her cancer. And for me, I really didn't care about that, and I just wanted Mom to start breathing better. My world was crushed when the pulmonary doctor declared that Mom only had 1 or 2 days left before she would pass. Upon hearing him say that, I cried out that I had failed her, and I was fast losing any sense of hope that remained. However, even with this dire prognosis, I still had to hold on to what little hope was left because the alternative was far too unpalatable to consider. After this meeting, I ran into the room and I sat with Mom, and I melted upon her hand with a rain of tears. My body shook and shivered as I threw one clenched fist into the air and spasmed with grief. I leaned in and desperately said to her many of the things I had said so often in the prior week, such as how much I loved her and how proud of her I was. Even though I didn't know if she could hear me, I reminded her of who had been there to see her over the last few days and how everyone was getting along with each other and how we were joined together by our affection for and dedication to her. After sitting with Mom for a little bit, I touched base with my sister and I let her know that I needed a break. I did not feel like I had the capacity to watch Mom suffer anymore. I was worn down from a lack of sleep and from crying, and I was without my usual internal compass, and I had to step away before I became further traumatized. The idea of watching Mom slip away and struggle as I'd seen my grandmother do so many years earlier was just too much to bear. I also knew that my aunt was there and she could be there for Mom so she would not be alone. I did not feel as if I was abandoning her, and I knew that, or I rather hoped that Mom would understand. And perhaps most importantly, I wanted my last memories of her to be with her eyes open and talking to me lovingly. It was time for me to step away. Even as I recognized my need to take a break, I thought that if Mom was still around after I had a good night's sleep, I would come back and I would be with her if I was feeling up to the task. It was really difficult to recenter myself as I was stuck between states of grief, denial, hope, and acceptance. In my conversations with other family members and the nursing staff throughout the day, I explained that I could not mourn for Mom while she was still with us, and I could not give up hope while she was still alive. So I was in between these states, and so before leaving, I decided to spend a little more time with Mom so I could say goodbye again. And I noticed that my aunt was already there in the room. She beckoned for me to join, and we sat together silently, watching Mom while she labored for every breath. My aunt and I have always been close, and after a while, we began to talk about some of the suffering and tragedy we were experiencing. What jumped out to me was that I had thought that I could outsmart cancer, and I was brutally wrong. And I told her that the cancer had always been one step ahead of us. I explained that I found the experience to be both humbling and terrifying at the same time, and I finally had to be honest and admit that I really did not understand cancer. We also talked about how I was in denial about Mom's health. Everyone else around me was assuming that Mom would not pull through, while I was still holding on to hope that she would rally like the champion I knew she was, the champion. My aunt also told me some of the things that she was feeling, and it felt good to share with her while we both sat with and watched over Mom so lovingly. While we were talking, a young woman came by and she introduced herself as a social worker and asked if we wanted to talk. She had the look and feel of a social worker with soft features and a fragile kindness about her. I started out by recounting many of the things I'd been telling my aunt, most especially my underestimation of the power of cancer. I also touched on the awareness that I was still in denial about Mom's condition. I spoke earnestly about the feeling that I had failed her. After having spent so much time over the prior months taking care of Mom and trying to help her beat this terrible disease, it was all in vain. I reported to this social worker that I realized that my feelings of failure were born out of a false illusion of a sense of control. If I believed that I had ever been capable of healing Mom, that would imply that I was in fact in control and not the cancer. Eventually, this social worker left, and my aunt and I resumed our vigil, watching over Mom intensely and trying to send her the warmth and love of our energy. And perhaps it was the lack of sleep, or maybe I was inebriated with grief because I thought for a moment that I saw or felt a group of angels or some kind of divine presence in the room with us. My heart really wanted to believe that they were there to be with one of their own, to... One moment, please. To bring her back, into the fold now that her job was done here on earth. My father showed up a little while later, and he wanted to spend some time with Mom, so I took that as a sign for me to say goodbye one last time. By now, I had said goodbye so many times, each time wanting her to feel my love and unsure if I would have another opportunity to do so again. It got easier after a while, as in the days prior, I had really connected with Mom while she was still conscious and active. The fact that she had let me know that she understood and felt all the love around her made all the subsequent goodbyes a lot easier. That being said, the process was hard, and I did not want it to feel rote or hurried. Each goodbye felt more desperate as the message changed from fight to how proud of her I was. Finally, I was ready to go, so I grabbed my belongings and I kissed her on the forehead one last time before taking the elevator downstairs. On the ride down, I was feeling bitter, and I noticed a woman with black hair who was not that much younger than Mom, and what crossed my mind was to wonder why she was alive and healthy while my mom was fading away so fast. It was a strange sensation to look around scornfully at other people and to realize that they were healthy and Mom was not. And to me, that underscored just how fragile our human bodies really are. Little do we know as we go about our daily lives just how precious life is. And it's not until we are in the proximity of death do we really even begin to understand. After I reached the grand entryway of the hospital, I stopped briefly to reflect on the gravity of the moment. I really loved Mom, and I wanted to be there for her, but I was exhausted and completely tapped out emotionally, so I needed to go home and to rest. Pausing just 1 foot away from the exit, I told myself that if I stepped outside this building, I was giving up on Mom, and she would likely die. Walking out that door would be, in effect, admitting that all hope was gone and Mom would soon pass. And with that, I stepped outside and on to my new reality. Monday. When I got home, I did my best to decompress from everything that had been going on by listening to music and playing video games. And both of these activities helped me to stay distracted. As I laid down that night to sleep, I had my phone close by, ready to receive what felt like an imminent update from my sister or my aunt, telling me that Mom had passed. After waking up around 6 o'clock in the morning, I checked in with my sister, and she reported that Mom was still hanging in there with no change in status. I was extremely happy to hear this news, and I felt markedly better after some rest. With purpose, I dropped my daughter off at school, and I headed into the hospital to be with Mom again. When I arrived, it felt like the air was heavy. Just by stepping through the door and walking down the hallway towards Mom, emotions flooded back in and began to overtake me. I entered the room and I sat down next to her bed, holding her hand and placing my palm on her forehead one last time. Each of the prior days, when I first came into the room, I would speak up in the hopes that Mom would open her eyes, and most of the time she would. However, there was less of a response each day as time passed. This day, only one of her eyes opened, and it was completely glazed over. This sight was more than a little bit unsettling to me. I also noticed that her body was colder than I had remembered from the day before, and she was no longer squeezing my hand. It was clear that she was slipping away. I did not want to give up hope, but everyone else had already written her off, and I was starting to see why. In my throngs of despair, I sang to her some of my favorite songs. You Are My Sunshine, as well as Sweet Baby James, hoping to bring her some comfort. Wanting to salve her, I whispered in her ear that I knew she was in pain, and I was so sorry that she had to go through this process. And again, I told her especially how sorry I was that I had failed in taking care of her. She was my one and only mother, my dearest love, and I felt like I should have been able to keep her out of the hospital by somehow outsmarting her illness or even having my love endure to the point of protecting her. The more I thought about it, I figured that I must have done something wrong in the past for this to happen to Mom, as I had essentially been her guardian for so long. I felt responsible, having gone to so many of her appointments and having talked to her and thought about her all the time. I figured that I must have failed her along the way. As hard as I tried, I could not see any way around feeling culpable for what was happening to Mom, as irrational as that may be. After saying goodbye once again and kissing her 1,000 times on the forehead, I had to leave. Seeing her in pain and watching her slip away even more was too much, just too much to bear. And even though I had a decent amount of sleep from the night before, I was still tapped out, and I did not have the emotional capacity to deal with such a moment. And based on this sentiment, I left the hospital in haste. I was overwhelmed with despair, panic, anger, and completely unsure of how to begin to process the myriad of emotions I was awash in. Once I arrived at home, I was obnoxiously greeted by the remains of a massive snowstorm from the day prior. And most of the driveway had not been cleared yet, as that's normally my responsibility. Even though I was nearly crippled emotionally, the driveway had to be cleaned before all the snow froze over. So I bundled up and I began the task. With my snowblower in hand, I aggressively punched into and chipped away at the large snowbanks that lay before me. Patiently and methodically, I worked my way through, pausing only when the machine became overheated due to the sheer volume of snow it was churning through. And when that happened, I grabbed my large metal shovel and I picked away at the edges of the snowbanks. With purpose, I launched large clusters of semi-frozen snow into the air until I nearly collapsed from exhaustion. I was just incredibly frustrated about the situation with Mom, and I was mad at the world for letting it happen to her and despondent that I had been unable to do anything about it. All that being said, it was somewhat stress relieving to attack the snow, almost as if I were hitting a punching bag and taking out my anger and frustration. All throughout the process of removing the snow, I was slowly coming to terms with the understanding that hope really was gone, and I had been wrong all along about Mom's condition. I had to accept that the new reality I was living in would not change, regardless of how pissed off I was. With perhaps half of the driveway cleared, I stepped inside for a break and I sat down in my computer to begin to work on a eulogy for Mom. I had always been incredibly close to my mother, and I wanted to give a heartfelt statement on how amazing a person she was and how much she meant to me. I let those words pour out of my heart and on to the paper. It was surreal to be writing a eulogy for someone who was still alive, and that was part of the problem, as she was neither alive nor dead at that point. It had been difficult to be at be home instead of at the hospital with Mom, even though being there with her would perhaps have been equally hard, but in a different way. I had many great connections with Mom in the prior days before she stopped verbally responding to visitors, and I wanted my last memories to be that way, rather than of her writhing around in bed due to a lack of oxygen. I needed to find some way to distract myself while at home, so I tried to get some work done, and when that grew stale, I played video games. Then I spent some time working on and editing chapters in this cancer memoir leading up to her hospital admission. It was incredibly difficult for me, given that I knew she was most likely not going to make it. With incredible frustration, I looked over my words from just a few weeks prior when I had been so upbeat and hopeful, talking about having Mom coming back home to rest with us. And now that hopeful fantasy had turned into a hopeless disaster. All throughout the day, I continued to check my phone, not going more than 10 or 15 minutes in between each time so that I could know the exact moment my mother had passed. I continued to toil with not being there, but again, I had to remind myself that I did not feel as if I was emotionally equipped to be with her in that moment. I could not bear to watch her suffer any further. Completely broken, I was in and out of moments where I could handle reality, shaking my head because I could not believe that any of it was true. Filled to the brim with emotion and overflowing with distress, I pumped my fists in the air and I screamed with furious agony, hoping desperately to wake up from this nightmare. For some reason, I found it incredibly soothing to watch a World War II documentary. Given the enormity of that subject matter, more or less the fate of the world, I was able to dive in and get lost in the story. This was something that had perhaps similar weight in my mind to the idea of losing my mother. Losing Mom would be earth-breaking, ground-shattering, and reality redefining. And this documentary on the war to end all wars was just what the doctor ordered. Despite its potency, I could only watch for so long, as I eventually would remember what I was trying to distract myself from. This led me to pause the program so I could cry and let out some more emotion as I had before. I kept thinking about everything I had been through over the prior 20 months. From my initial cancer diagnosis to Mom's diagnosis, and to now when everything I had worked so hard to protect was in grave danger. I kept asking myself, how could I not feel like I had failed? Even though I had tried my best to be a good caregiver, I wondered if I had perhaps spent some more time with Mom and had been more attentive, that might have made a difference. Without a doubt, I understood that it was irrational to feel that way, but it also felt entirely natural. As I thought about Mom losing her fight, the anticipated loss was so ground-shattering that I could not wrap my head around it. I really couldn't. Unlike everything else so far in my cancer journey, I was unable to define the parameters of this experience. I could not even begin to put everything into perspective to understand what the ramifications would be in my life going forward. Even though I felt that having all of Mom's friends and family come together to watch over her had brought us together, that seemed like an insignificant consolation prize to losing the most important person in my life. Mom felt so real to me. As I sat in my house in stunned silence, I could feel her warmth and love all around me. All I had to do was close my eyes, and I could imagine her hugging me. I could remember how closely I held her hand to my face while I sat with her in the hospital, basking in the warmth of her touch. While missing her and wanting to reconnect, I thought about searching through the many pictures I had of her in my computer, and that was really hard. So, as just seeing a photo of her smiling reminded me of how cruel, incredibly cruel, this new reality was. In my phone, I had also saved several dozen of her voicemails, but I was far too vulnerable to listen to any of them in that moment. I kept going back to the fact that I was stuck between states of hope and fear, and I was tormented because I was unable to mourn for her or give up on her while she was still alive. Talking about it and working on this book did help a little bit, and after some thought, I decided that I should talk to my daughter and prepare her for Grandma's inevitable passing. She and my mom had been incredibly close, and it was just heartbreaking to think of my daughter not being able to spend any more time with her while growing up. I had been stalling, but I could not wait any longer, so I called my daughter into the room so we could talk, and she noticed that I had been crying, and being ever attentive as she was, she moved her hands to wipe the tears away. And when she asked me why I was sad, I had to tell her that Grandma was sick and might die. She burst into tears, stating that she did not want Grandma to become an angel, and she wanted her to stay with us. I reminded her of some of the fun things they had done in the past, and when she could not recall those moments because she was so young, I told her that I would show her pictures to help her remember. Then she looked me in the eyes and asked me if I was going to die one day after she becomes a mother, and I told her yes. She looked at me lovingly and told me that she would always remember me. And it was so deeply touching, given the gravity of the moment. After my daughter ran back in the living room to play, I was left by myself, and I quickly returned to the depths of my misery. I shook my head in disbelief, trying to wake up from a bad dream. I was completely in shock and unable to imagine life without Mom. One small relief that I came back to was that if not for what had happened and was happening to Mom, I would not know about my own genetic disorder, and that was some sort of a blessing. Another silver lining was that given how much emotion, pure, raw, real emotion was flowing through me and the enormity of the impact of these events in my life, I concluded that when I was eventually able to get through my feelings, I would be stronger and more resilient. I knew that I had to get on top of all this emotion that was dominating me, but I was really unsure how, so I returned to watching that World War II documentary until I drifted off to sleep. Tuesday. I woke up rather early that next morning and I checked my phone to see if Mom had passed overnight, and I was encouraged to see that she had not. My aunt told me that she was still relatively stable and comfortable, and when I heard that news, I could not wait to get back to the hospital to spend some more time with her. Early Monday morning, the doctors had given her just 2 days to live, and those 2 days were now up. So I thought that perhaps Mom was waiting for me to come back to the hospital so I could be with her when she passed, and that felt right to me. It was an emotional ride as I drove to the hospital, but I had an incredible sense of purpose about me. I was going where I needed to be with someone who loved me so dearly. I decided that when I was sitting with Mom that day, I should start encouraging her to let go rather than to keep fighting as I had been for the days prior. Perhaps it was the rest, or perhaps just some time away from the hospital, because I was starting to accept that she was going to pass, and I wanted to be there as she made her way from this world to the next. Once I arrived, I sat down and I grabbed her hand, and it seemed warm to me, perhaps warmer than the day before, and that reminded me that she was still alive and with us. I leaned over the bed and I placed both of my hands on her face, wanting to be held by my wonderful mother once again. I desperately needed to feel her touch. I loved the feel of her hands against my face, and when I held them there, I cried and cursed the world for doing this to my dear mother. Once I had gathered enough composure, I leaned in to kiss her on the forehead and nose, and I whispered into her ear that it was okay to let go. I told her that I was sorry she was in so much pain and that it was not fair that this was happening to her. I also told her that she had to do what was best for her. If that meant letting go, then that was okay. I emphasized how proud of her I was, saying that everyone else had already counted her out, and she was still breathing and still fighting. However, by now, her breathing was noticeably more shallow than it had been the day before, and honestly, that scared the crap out of me. Every time there was some kind of a pause between her breaths, my world stopped. And then when she breathed again, everything was okay for a moment or so. I kept telling myself that as long as she was breathing, there was a chance for the antibiotics and steroids to help solve this issue in her lungs. And even though we still had her cancer to deal with, I just wanted Mom to survive one more day. Clearly, I was confused, with part of me telling her that it was okay to let go and another part of me still holding on to the hope that she would come back to us, and then we could keep fighting this cancer together. As I glanced over at her IV machine, I noticed that they were no longer giving her that TPN nutrition. My hopes were dashed even further as it became clear that the medical professionals could see that Mom would not survive, even as I struggled to accept that fact myself. I stayed with her for most of the day, except for a little break for lunch and the occasional few minutes to step outside and to clear my head. We always made sure to have at least one person with Mom, and my aunt, my father, and my sister were all dutiful in that regard. Just before dinner, I decided to go out for a walk to get some fresh air, and asked my aunt again to sit with Mom while I was gone. And before I left, Before I left, I said goodbye yet again to Mom, telling her how much I loved her and how proud of her I was. Her breathing had been slowing throughout the day, and it felt as if we were getting closer to the end. So each time I left the room, I wondered if she would still be there when I got back. That being said, I knew how strong Mom was, and I believed she would indeed still be there when I returned. Once I finally made my way downstairs and out the front door, it was wonderful to breathe in some fresh air and to step outside of the hospital, if only for a few moments. Now it was evening time, and I could see many staff members running around, and some were rushing to catch a train, and others were walking to the parking garage to go home. I was reminded that life keeps going on no matter what any of us are going through. As I continued to think about my own feelings and what I was going through, I realized that Mom was still alive, and I really wanted to be with her. Earlier that week, I was traumatized and tapped out emotionally and could not bear to watch her suffer. That was in the past now. Now that I had reached what I believed to be a greater wisdom. While she was still alive, I wanted to be with her and to be present emotionally and to stay connected to her and the moment. More or less, I wanted to offer Mom the best of my energy, the best of my love, and the fullness of my attention as she spent her last hours with us here on earth in this flawed body. I felt ultra focused and full of positive energy as I made my way back to Mom's room, as that walk to clear my head had really paid off. Returning, I peeked into the room and I saw that Mom was just as she had been before, laying back quietly and breathing with light and steady breaths and occasionally moaning. It was incredibly difficult to see her in such pain and discomfort. And while I was rooting for her to come back to us, I understood that her body was breaking down. I had to accept that. However, seeing Mom breathing and feeling her presence reminded me that she was still with us. It reminded me that I had made the right decision to go back to the hospital to be with her during these perhaps final moments of her life. As I laid my hands on Mom, hoping to give her my energy, I closed my eyes and I devoutly said a prayer. Over and over again. One moment. Over and over again, I asked her to be granted strength and wisdom. Whispering into her ear, I told her that I was sorry she was in so much pain and that she did not deserve any of this because she was such a good person. I also reminded her of how wonderful a mother she was and how all her friends and family members had gathered around her to show their love and devotion. Feeling stronger than I had been earlier, I was no longer bawling every time I opened my mouth. Rather, I was speaking with conviction and kindness. It was an important transition for me to go from fear of watching Mom suffer to feeling the need to be with her while she was still here and alive, even if barely so. I continued to lay my hands on her, saying prayers and whispering words of encouragement, and then I moved my way down to her feet. By now, I had seen 2 different people performing Reiki on Mom, and I had observed them placing one hand on her feet and one on her hands, and I intended to replicate that technique. When I placed my hands on her feet, I noticed how cold they were, and I immediately began rubbing them. I thought that it would help Mom if I could warm her feet up and get her circulation going. Even though everyone else had written her off, I figured that helping to improve her blood flow could only be a good thing. My aunt came back in the room a little while later, and she joined me by Mom's side, and we both lovingly worked to rub her feet to warm them up. We thought it was a kind thing for us to do, and it showed our devotion, and we hoped that Mom appreciated our effort. My dad walked in a few minutes later, and he sat down next to Mom as well to keep her company as we continued to warm Mom up. Soon enough, it was shift change time, and we had a new nurse come in and check on Mom. And I gave this nurse a basic rundown on Mom's condition, what to keep an eye on as far as clues about how comfortable Mom was. And then I reconfirmed that they were still giving her antibiotics and steroids. And more or less, I described to this nurse Mom as being stable. After I finished talking, my dad spoke up, and I was taken aback as he told this nurse that it seemed like Mom was rapidly slipping away. That type of thinking was a major danger to my fantasy, because in my mind, Mom was stable and she still had a chance to completely recover. About an hour later, it was time for my dad to go home after 4 days in the hospital. My sister and I had set up Mom's room in the hospital so both of us could stay there overnight and watch her. And my aunt slept in the family lounge just a floor above. It was an incredibly difficult time for me, much as it had been in the prior days watching Mom struggle. I could tell that she was getting closer to passing, and that all that hope I had so gallantly held on to for the prior few days was all but gone. As I had for most of my visit that day, and would for the rest of it, I sat with Mom and I held her hand. All I wanted to do was hold her hand. I squeezed it over and over again, trying to send her my love and to let her know that I was with her through this difficult time. It was an amazing indulgence to still be able to place her warm hand on my face. And when I did that, nothing else in the world mattered. Wednesday morning. Now, way past visiting hours, the nurse turned off the lights in the room and I finished setting up my chair for bed. After I got ready, I closed my eyes and I held Mom's hand as I prepared for a long night's watch. And though I was beyond exhausted, I did not feel safe or comfortable enough to close my eyes or to keep my eyes closed, since I was worried about opening them and discovering that Mom was no longer breathing. The idea of waking up to her still body was far too traumatic. So I tried as hard as I could to stay awake and continued to squeeze her hand. From time to time, I got out of my chair and I whispered in her ears, trying to shush her to sleep and to let her know how sorry and to let her know how sorry I was that she was in so much pain. From the bottom of my heart, I told her again how dearly I loved her and that she did not deserve what was happening to her, and that she was an amazing and loving person, and that she was cherished by me and all who knew her. A couple of hours so after my aunt had left to go lay down and get some rest, we called her back because it seemed like Mom was about to go. My aunt wanted to be there no matter what for the moment of passing, and the three of us lovingly stood vigil around Mom. After 15 or 20 minutes had passed, we decided that it had been a false alarm, so my aunt returned to the family lounge to get some sleep, and my sister and I resumed our watch. Over the course... One moment, please. Over the course of the next 2 hours, there would be several more false alarms, as it seemed like Mom was close to passing and then kept on going. As I glanced up at the wall, I noticed that it was now past 2 o'clock in the morning, and I wondered if we would make it to breakfast once again with Mom still around. Would I again be allowed to step outside of the room and enjoy a nice plate of eggs, a bagel, and some coffee before coming back to see my mom? For me, that felt like it would be a huge accomplishment, as we were almost through day 3 when the doctors had given her less than 2 days to live. As the minutes progressed, so did Mom's breathing problems, as she would occasionally cough a little bit before returning to her labored breath. And I noticed this change in symptoms, but I continued to press on, holding her hand and doing my best to stay awake. After staring at her vital signs on the monitor for a little while, I looked up and it was now 4 o'clock in the morning. And even though I was really hoping that Mom would make it to breakfast, I did have to admit that it seemed like she was fading fast. I must have dozed off at some point, because all of a sudden I was back in my kitchen at home and Mom was standing there, eyes wide open and smiling as she delivered the punchline to a funny story. This took me off guard. I had really been missing her, and I felt disconnected from her as she lay in that hospital bed, no longer opening her eyes when I spoke. Seeing her standing up, smiling, and talking was a shock, and for just a moment, my mom was happy and healthy, and everything was okay. She was also holding my 2-month-old nephew in her arms, and I felt a warmth of love wash over me as she beckoned me closer for a hug. Just before I reached her for that hug, I woke up and I remembered that I was still in the hospital. And I looked over at Mom and I noticed that she was no longer breathing, though it did not seem as if she had passed yet. I must have fallen asleep, and during that time, Mom reached out to me just before she stopped breathing. She wanted to give me a beautiful send-off with a message of love. What a gift that was. As soon as I saw that she was no longer breathing, I called my aunt to come join us. And those 2 or 3 minutes it took for her to arrive were incredibly uncomfortable, as I was just itching to get out of that room and the hospital itself as soon as possible. Next chapter, the aftermath. This is my battles with cancer. A patient and caregiver's candid memoir. This is my story, fighting cancer and trying to help my mother as she fought cancer. I published the book on Amazon along with my other 2 books, Trading Quotes and Trading Wisdom. Those are also available, but this book I want to be free. I want it to be available to anybody who's fighting cancer, anybody who knows someone who's fighting cancer, anybody who's grieving a loss, because you're going to hear about me grieving my loss in the next chapter and the chapters to come. That was really hard, and I'm glad I've done it. So, folks, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with another chapter soon. Take care.